I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Medford, Massachusetts. I'm also the co-director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at Fletcher. I do research in a variety of areas, including regulation of the global economy and economic sanctions.
Can you draw the general outline of the U.S. foreign policy in Central Asia?
I think U.S. foreign policy in Central Asia, in terms of priorities right now, yeah, I think there are a couple. The most obvious is probably trying to make sure that there is not too much sanctions evasion with respect to Russia because of, obviously, the U.S. sanctions against Russia because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So one of the things we've seen in the last year is that there's been a surge of U.S. exports to Central Asia. There's also been a surge of Central Asian exports to Russia. Some of this is obviously a result of the sanctions. And I think, to be honest, the United States probably is okay with a fair amount of it. They just want to make sure that things like, strategic military goods are not in that in those trade goods. That's priority one. I think priority two is really the facilitation of more domestic reforms. I mean, it's safe to say that Uzbekistan's a more open society now than it was a decade ago. Kazakhstan's a more open society than it was a decade ago. It would be nice to see the other countries in Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, follow that example and also demonstrate a degree of economic, political openness. And I suppose the third concern, if there is one, is ensuring that the countries in the region don't become too dependent on any nearby great power. And here I'm not speaking so much of Russia as I am of China. Which is to say, China's obviously engaged in a lot of investment here. I think on the whole, the United States understands that's certainly something that's going to happen. It's a question of whether countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are going to be so indebted to China that they wind up, becoming, their sovereignty winds up becoming too compromised. We are obviously less concerned about that with respect to Uzbekistan, for example.
Does the U.S. foreign policy have a flow in Central Asia?
It's an interesting question. I think because stock means what exists already, what is the status quo, and the flow is whether there's any change. And I think, frankly, for the United States, I think U.S. foreign policy in Central Asia for far too long was, to be honest, premised on security and in particular Afghanistan. As I think I said yesterday, I think unfortunately U.S. foreign policy in Central Asia was too instrumental. It was looking at Central Asia as a means to an end, which would the end be to resupply U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Although the U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban takeover in 2021 in some ways poses security challenges for Central Asia, there is a weird way in which I think it's actually been beneficial for U.S. foreign policy in the region, because now, U.S. foreign policy in the region is focused on the actual Central Asian countries. It's not, I think, contrary to a lot of concerns, I don't think there's any expectation that there's no expectation in the United States that Central Asia is somehow going to balance against China or balance against Russia. That's not practical in the geography that exists. I think what the United States would like to see is an acceleration of trends we've seen since 2016 in this region in the form of domestic reforms in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the resolution of border disputes, and a greater degree of regional unity, because this allows these countries to have some degree of autonomy from Russia and China, and allows them to pursue the multi-vector diplomacy that they're trying to do. And we would like to think that the United States is an important vector, I think from the U.S. perspective, the fact that Secretary of State Blinken visited recently is indicative of the degree to which the United States wants to see a free, sovereign, and independent group of Central Asian nations.
Does the political polarization in the U.S. affect its foreign policy in Central Asia?
Political polarization in the United States is undeniably a problem, and it can lead to some significant swings in U.S. foreign policy. That said, one area where there is bipartisan cooperation remains, for lack of a way of putting it, concern about China. China has become the number one foreign policy priority of the United States, maybe not containing it in the same way as it was during the Cold War, but at least ensuring that recognition there is a great power competition between China and the United States, trying to ensure that that competition is on a level playing field and that China does not cheat as war. So in that sense, I don't think polarization is going to affect U.S. foreign policy in Central Asia because, as I said, I think one of the concerns, and this is a bipartisan concern, is to make sure that China is a constructive partner in the development of the Central Asian economies and does become a predatory partner.
Are there any trends left unnoticed in the Uzbek-American relations?
I think, unfortunately, here the answer is it depends on where you're asking this question. And I regret to say this, there's an asymmetry in Uzbek-U.S. relations, and that the United States is, I assume, a reasonably important country for Uzbekistan for obvious reasons in terms of multi-vector diplomacy. And here, I'm embarrassed to admit, if you ask most Americans to identify where Uzbekistan is on a map, they couldn't do it. And so I think, honestly, the answer here is that I would frankly like more Americans to be aware of the existence of Uzbekistan, to learn about Uzbekistan. As someone who, I was first in this country in 1994, and it's been wonderful to come back. It was wonderful to see, the Tashkent, wonderful to see Samarkand. This country has a tremendous amount to offer, not just the United States, but the world in terms of it's a crossroads of civilization. If I had a wish, it would be that Americans were conscious of the fact that Uzbekistan was an important country and should be a vital partner in the United States.